to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on the subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing is entitled, "Thoughts and Prayers Are Not Enough: How Mass Shootings Harm Communities, Local Economies, and Economic Growth." I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Friends, when innocent children are being mass murdered in schools, thoughts and prayers are not enough to assure parents their children will come home safely from school. When worshipers are mass murdered in places of worship, thoughts and prayers are not enough to protect worshipers while worshiping. When shoppers are mass murdered in marketplaces, thoughts and prayers are not enough to prevent future marketplace mass murders and the consequences that follow. This year alone, we've had 354 mass shootings in 200 days, including 16 mass murders, according to the Gun Violence Archive. Friends, it has become painfully clear that the good guy with a gun to take out a bad guy with a gun, the kill or be killed philosophy, is not the solution. And just as we must concern ourselves with saving lives, we must also concern ourselves with the impact on the quality of life after a mass shooting. I thank Mayor Brown for being with us today. The tragic mass shooting at the Tops food store in his hometown of Buffalo, New York, had immediate impacts on the community it serves. The Tops Friendly Market store, once a hub of commerce within its community, was forced to shut down for 2 months. According to the Buffalo-Niagara Partnership, a chamber of commerce in the Buffalo area, during those 2 months, people were displaced from jobs and their community faced food accessibility challenges. It's important to understand the impact that mass shootings have on employment. Research has shown increases in unemployment by almost 2% in areas that have experienced mass shootings. Mass shootings also have been shown to impact home values. Research has shown that mass shootings can lead to a decrease in area housing prices of up to 3%. Mass shootings at schools have been shown to cause a decline in home values up to nearly 8% within that school district. This impact occurs because a school where a mass shooting occurs might then be considered unsafe or stigmatized. Families might be less inclined to move to that school district, and other families might choose to leave. Teachers become more inclined to leave the district. In summary, mass shootings can have a devastating impact on communities. They hurt businesses, causing resignations, layoffs, litigation costs, and increased cost of insurance. Property values decrease, and the tax base erodes, leading to cuts in fire, police, and sanitation departments. My hope is that by examining these issues today, we might come to understand how mass shootings have a greater harmful impact than we previously knew. And I trust that this understanding will cause us to strive to do even more to prevent mass shootings. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on this urgent matter. At this time, I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Emmer, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to the witnesses for coming to speak with us today. I look forward to hearing your testimony. Cities and communities across the country are dealing with a surge in violence. In fact, over the past 2 years, the United States has seen an increased rate of all types of violence and crime. In 2021, 68 out of 70 of the largest United States police jurisdictions saw increases in violent crime, which includes homicide, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault. More specifically, we're seeing this rise in crime in cities where large-scale theft, looting, and robbery are plaguing communities. We frequently hear stories of businesses in cities like Chicago or San Francisco who are forced to relocate, shut down, or limit their hours to protect their employees and manage the extra costs of security just to operate every day. Many businesses, particularly the smallest businesses, are faced with the wrenching decision whether to close and abandon the community or stay and deal with the risks of remaining open. Those decisions aren't just based on dollars and cents. Business owners must consider the safety of their employees and their customers. When a business closes its doors, the entire community feels the effect. Jobs are lost. Customers must find somewhere else to get the things they need. A vacant storefront invites more criminal activity. The value of homes in the area goes down, and a community begins to deteriorate. In the face of such rampant crime, law enforcement, unfortunately, does not often have the resources necessary to protect communities, from staffing issues to an ability to enforce the laws. Democrats were the party of defund the police, and these political attacks against law and order have depleted law enforcement morale and resources. Even though our committee does not have jurisdiction over crime, I welcome the opportunity to discuss how violent crime affects a community's economy. Our witnesses can help us understand how violent crime affects local economies and limits the services that are available to communities across the country. For many communities, addressing crime and violence starts with state and local leadership. Soft on crime policies have made matters worse in jurisdictions where crime rates are highest. The absence of the threat of meaningful prosecution affects the safety of residents and businesses. Today, we invited a business owner who has dealt with these challenges in Minnesota for several years now. Brian Ingram has managed to keep his restaurant doors open to the community of St. Paul, despite an unbelievable series of crimes against his business, his employees, and his customers. I think we'll all benefit from hearing his story. And so again, Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for holding this hearing today, because Americans should never, never feel this level of unsafety in their own communities. We must return to a society of law and order. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chairman Green. To Mayor Brown and all of the witnesses here today, I thank you for coming to help us deal with this very difficult and complicated issue. The first thing I must say is not all Democrats have said defund the police, and so let's be clear about that. From mass shootings in Buffalo, New York, to the recent tragedy in Highland Park, Illinois, these horrific incidents have been far too frequent. In this year alone, there have been more than 300 mass shootings devastating families and communities. The reverberations of loss and grief are felt long after the last bullet is shot. Neighborhoods and local businesses in affected areas struggle to cope with changing dynamics within the community, including negative impacts to the housing market, store closures, additional costs for security, and unexpected loss of revenue and employment. I urge my fellow members of Congress to stop the bleeding and take action to support healing in these communities across our great nation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. Today, we welcome the testimony of our distinguished witnesses. First, we have Abel Brother, who is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa. Next, we have Byron Brown, who is the mayor of the city of Buffalo, New York. Next, we have Sarah Bird Sharps, who is the senior director of research at Everytown for Gun Safety. Next, we have Ruchi Singh, who is an assistant professor at Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia. And finally, we have Brian Ingram, who is the founder and CEO of Purpose Driven Restaurants. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer that will indicate how much time you have left. I would ask that you be mindful of the timer so that we can be respectful of both the witnesses and the committee members' time. Without objection, your written statements will be made a part of the record. Mr. Brother, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
I would like to thank the subcommittee for holding this and having me talking to you about this topic. I think it's a very
Mr. Brother, would you move a little closer to the microphone, please?
I'm an economist. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa. And in my research, I study the economic consequences of violent crime, gang-related crimes, domestic terror attacks, and mass shootings. And today I want to talk to you about the economic consequences of mass shootings in the US. So in a study with SNU staff, we look at mass shootings from 2000 to 2013, talking about hundreds of mass shootings, and we're interested in documenting what happens to the local economies. And what we find is after a mass shooting, the consequences are tremendous and permanent. We find a decrease in employment of about 2%, a decrease in earnings of 2.5%, a decrease in housing prices, and also a decrease in the wages, potentially due to a decrease in productivity, which I will come back to. Overall, we find that these communities, these counties that were hit by mass shootings, lost about 100,000 jobs for the period 2000 to 2013. It's a lot of jobs. And this raised the question of why. What are the mechanisms through which mass shootings can affect these local economies? And we look at different channels. One of the first channels that we look at is consumer sentiment, or the way people in these communities feel about their economy, about local businesses. And we find in the months and years after a mass shooting, these become more pessimistic and negative. We also look at the role of the media. I've looked at the national media coverage of all these mass shootings myself for ABC, CBS, NBC, and what we find is every single minute of coverage of these mass shootings exacerbates dramatically the consequences on local economies. But also many studies now showing that additional media coverage leads to more copycats and other shootings. We also look at which type of industry is affected. And we find it's mostly the private sector, service industry, manufacturing, many different sectors, many different businesses are affected. This leads to, our findings leads potentially to different policy prescriptions. The first one I want to talk about is media coverage. I think we need to have some sort of policy that limits the type of media coverage of these mass shootings, potentially a John Doe type of policy, meaning that we should refrain ourselves from talking about the perpetrators, his identity, the motives, the strategies used. Everything is available online easily on Wikipedia. In terms of other type of policies that would be important, I think we need to think about why productivity goes down. And one of the things we did was to look at a survey from the CDC that asked hundreds of thousands of Americans every year about their health, their mental health, their physical health, and many other questions. And we matched this to the mass shooting data. And what we find is, of course, mass shootings decrease mental health in the short run, but also in the long run. And we find that respondents in these communities increasingly report for months and years that they're not able to do their normal activities, like working, like taking care of their children. And these effects are permanent for years. And this explains why potentially productivity goes down, why earnings go down. They go down because jobs are lost, but also because productivity is going down. People are missing work, missing days of work, and are less productive at work. So we need policy, public policy, to provide financial support, but also medical support, not only in the short run, but also potentially in medium and long run, helping these communities financially and to provide them medical care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brother. Mr. Brown, You are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Emmer, Congressman Waters, Congressman Cleaver, members of the House Financial Services Committee, I'm honored to be here today to discuss the harmful impact of mass shootings on communities, local economies, and economic growth. On Saturday, May 14th, 2022, the unthinkable happened in Buffalo, New York. Our family members, friends, and neighbors were simply going about their business, grocery shopping, when without warning they were interrupted by deadly gunfire. An outsider opened fire and killed 10 innocent people and injured 3 others. It was a moment that changed our community forever. 52 days after the devastating shooting, we reopened the Tops supermarket. However, nothing we do will ever repair the heartache for the families who lost loved ones. But we will always stand united with them. In the City of Good Neighbors, we are a loving and resilient community, a community that will always remember, we will never forget. This horrific tragedy highlighted many issues that have impacted our community and Black and brown communities nationwide. Across our country, we have seen over a century of underfunding by the federal government in Black and brown neighborhoods. This has led to unacceptable increases in gun violence, segregation, crime, poor health outcomes, and generational poverty. These factors made Buffalo a target for the May 14th shooter, whose stated goal was to kill as many Black people as possible. Every mass shooting has a significant economic impact. However, the mass shooting in Buffalo was different. It was an act of domestic terrorism fueled by racism and white supremacy. This was perceived to be not only an attack on Black Buffalo, but an attack on Black America. In just the 2 weeks after the shooting, city departments, police, fire, sanitation, spent over $500,000 of unbudgeted dollars on overtime and other related services. That amount has continued to significantly increase as city government continues to play a vital role in our community's healing process and public safety needs. Gun violence has a lasting and negative impact on survivors, and experiencing these events in childhood has a lifelong impact on the psychological well-being and labor market participation of those involved. The May 14th shooting in Buffalo will impact an entire generation of children. This event has the potential to harm Buffalo's already economically disadvantaged Black community and further grow inequality. We must do whatever we can to combat this and provide the East Buffalo community with the funding for services such as counseling, educational enrichment, and lost wages. There should be federal funding to address the economic damage to communities that suffer mass shootings. I applaud President Biden and the bipartisan group of members of Congress for supporting the Safer Communities Act. While this law will save lives, it doesn't go far enough. I urge you to work with the Biden administration on reinstating an assault weapons ban. Assault weapons are exceptionally deadly firearms that are commonplace in mass shootings. An assault weapons ban may have prevented the May 14th massacre. I also urge you to ensure that the long-ignored and underfunded Black and brown communities like East Buffalo have the funding and supports that they need to ensure recovery from this tragedy and prevent and treat the trauma that violence has had on communities of color for generations. In addition, anti-Black hate crime legislation must be passed to address white supremacy and remove these hateful ideologies from our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Brown. Ms. Bird Sharps, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chair Green, Ranking Member Emmer, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to share our recent work on the economic cost of gun violence. It's an honor to appear before you to testify. My name is Sarah Bird Sharps, and I'm the Senior Director of Research at Everytown for Gun Safety Support Fund, the largest gun violence prevention organization in the U.S. With tragic and numbing regularity, we hear of shootings on our streets, in grocery stores, schools, hospitals, and too many other places. Every day in America, roughly 300 people join the toll of those killed and injured with guns. Today's focus is on mass shootings, of which there were 27 in which 4 or more people were killed, excluding the shooter, over the course of 2021, resulting in 136 fatalities. But I want to be clear, while devastating, costly, and fear-inducing far beyond the location where they occur, they make up less than 1% of all gun deaths and injuries. Without a doubt, the human cost of gun violence is the most devastating. No dollar amount could ever fully convey the cost for families and survivors of gun violence. But examining the serious economic consequences is essential as well for understanding just how extensive and expensive this crisis is. Our hope is that this research will help guide you and your colleagues as you weigh policies and actions to build safer communities. We worked with the leading health economist estimating the cost of injuries in the U.S. today, as well as with federal data sets on gun deaths and hospitalizations and extensive peer-reviewed research to understand these costs. The economic consequence to our nation of America's unrelenting gun violence epidemic is $557 billion a year, year after year. The government share of these costs, paid for by taxpayers, is $12.6 billion a year. That's nearly $35 million each day that could instead be invested in essential public goods like education, workforce development, and building healthier, safer, more sustainable communities. These figures are conservative estimates. They represent the lifetime costs associated with gun violence, starting at the scene of a shooting for things like emergency medical care or police investigations, continuing on to the long-term health care and criminal justice costs necessary. And they also include estimates for pain, suffering, and the lost well-being of victims and their families. Our report, released today, provides full details. But our estimates don't even begin to include the wider ripple effects, and those wider costs aren't marginal. As you just heard from Mayor Brown, and if you talk to any school superintendent or pediatrician in a town that has experienced a shooting, they can produce a long list of costs that extend far beyond the immediate items we're counting. Costs to address the trauma of children afraid to go back to school, neighborhood businesses and home values, and the larger reverberations on all those who live in a neighborhood where gun violence happens or who share an identity with someone who is the target of a shooting. While not everyone directly experiences gun violence, we all pay an economic price for it. The annual cost for gun violence in the U.S. is $1,698 for every resident. However, in states with stronger gun laws and fewer deaths and injuries, we found the economic toll to be less than half this amount. Policies that save lives also save on costs. While we're so grateful for the actions Congress took recently to address gun violence, there's still much more we can do. Half of the deadliest mass shootings over the past 5 years were committed by a shooter under 21. The Senate should urgently follow the House's lead and pass legislation to raise the age to purchase all firearms to 21. Further, the recent tragic mass shootings revealed a litany of advance warning signs. The Senate should pass the Federal Extreme Risk Protection Order Act, which would create a civil process that allowed loved ones and law enforcement to intervene when they see these signs across the country. Our research clearly shows we're spending precious funds on an epidemic that brings nothing of benefit and plenty of heartbreak and shattered lives. We place ourselves at a severe economic disadvantage in the globally competitive economy with these enormous outlays. Thank you again, Chair Green, Ranking Member Emmer, and members of the committee for allowing me to testify today.
Thank you, Ms. Bird-Sharps. Ms. Singh, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Subcommittee Chair Green, Ranking Member Emmer, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. I'm honored to contribute to the discussion on this important topic. I'm Ruchi Singh, Assistant Professor of Real Estate at the Terry College of Business at the University of Georgia. I've conducted academic research on real estate economics and the economics of crime since 2016. I'll be drawing today on the findings of my own research and on evidence from the relevant academic literature on mass shootings and gun violence. My comments today are about the economic effects of shooting, specifically in the context of schools, and about considerations that should be part of devising appropriate policies. I'm currently working on a paper studying the effects of mass shootings in schools on residential real estate prices. A number of academic studies have shown that crime in general impacts house prices negatively. This is probably unsurprising to most people. However, a mass shooting is not a typical type of crime. It is unlikely to be repeated at the same place. Nevertheless, my co-authors and I find that house prices in the affected school attendance area declined following such an incident. Our preliminary estimates show that mass shooting at schools lead to an average decline of 2.4% in house prices over the next 4 years. We also find evidence suggesting that the negative impact on house prices starts to fade away around 7 years after the incident. In the study, we define a mass shooting as an incident with 3 or more victims who were either injured or killed, excluding the shooter. Moreover, if one considers all episodes involving the discharge of a firearm in schools, the number is substantial. Starting from the Columbine incident in 1999 and continuing through May 2022, an estimated 311,000 students at schools have been exposed to gun violence during school hours. A number of academic studies have shown that students who are exposed to such shooting episodes suffer significant negative consequences. For example, a recent study co-authored by researchers from University of Texas at Austin, Northwestern University, and Stanford University found that exposure to a school shooting led to higher rates of chronic absenteeism and to an increased probability that students repeat grades over the next 2 years. These students also experienced negative long-term impacts. They were less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to enroll in college, and less likely to graduate from college. Moreover, they also had lower earnings, and they were less likely to be employed at the age of 24 to 26. Other researchers have also found similar evidence of lower test scores, increased absenteeism as a result of exposure to school shooting incident. Furthermore, there's evidence that the students experience a deterioration in mental health and increased antidepressant usage. More generally, being exposed to violent crimes, including those that may not involve guns, has also been shown to negatively affect students' educational achievement and their long-term outcomes. I now turn to things to think about in terms of policies to reduce school shootings. The finding of another research paper of mine suggests one way to reduce violent crime around schools is by placing civilian guards. Specifically, my co-authors and I analyzed the effectiveness of Chicago Public School Safe Passage program. This program draws upon parents and other adults from the local community to act as civilian guards around schools during arrival and dismissal times. We find that these extra eyes on the street reduce crime, especially violent crime, around schools. Moreover, the program resulted in improved school attendance. In thinking about ways to reduce the number of school shootings, policymakers need to be aware that there are different kinds of such incidents. For example, community policing is likely to reduce targeted and crime-related shootings, but it will probably not be effective in reducing indiscriminate shootings. Therefore, policies aiming to reduce school shootings will have to use multi-pronged approaches. Thank you. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Ms. Singh. I now recognize Mr. Ingram for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mr. Green, Representative Emmers, and Chairwoman Waters. My name is Brian Ingram. I own a collection of restaurants in Minnesota. I thank you for this opportunity to share some of my experiences over the last couple years. My entire life has been dedicated to food and coming together over a meal, about 30 years of my life. A few years ago, I had a vision of opening restaurants that not would just serve our guests, but serve our community. We made a commitment to donate 3% of our total sales back to those in need within our community. In 2019, my wife and I formed Purpose-Driven Restaurants. We opened a concept called Hope. Right before COVID hit, we chose to shut our restaurants down and serve our community. That ended up being about 300,000 free meals, 2 million pounds of food, not to mention all the outreach we did within shelters. And I don't say any of this to say, look at what we've done. I say, look at what we've done as a community. Sarah and I would have ran out of money instantly when we were doing this. It took our community standing with us to move forward. We stood with our city when George Floyd was tragically killed. We fed protesters, we fed our National Guard, we fed our police officers and first responders. As a person of faith, I believe that we're called to feed all of God's people. As businesses began to reopen in the Twin Cities, crime began to escalate. We saw it over and over. Our windows being shot out in our restaurants, criminals using the parking lot of one of my restaurants to be a place where they would kind of gather, and then they would head out to loot and destroy our cities. I made calls to 911 and we're told we have no officers to respond. Crime has now become a daily part of life. All 7 of my restaurants and office have been robbed numerous times, on many occasions by the same criminal. The same criminal would be released within 24 hours of robbing my restaurant and then show back up a few weeks later to rob me again. The lack of law enforcement's ability to respond. We would share footage of these folks breaking into our restaurants. These folks would walk in very lackadaisy. They had no worry that the police were responding or that they were even coming. I've watched them walk into our restaurants with no fear, search out our employee break rooms, steal purses, steal car keys, and then head out and steal that very car. As employees followed them, and the thieves basically dared them to do something. I've showed up at our restaurant oftentimes arriving before the police because we don't have enough officers to patrol our seats. I've had to walk into harm's way with people in our building. Far too often, I've sat with our employees as they've been attacked as they're trying to go home with their hard-earned tips. I've sat with our guests that have been carjacked within our restaurants. Our late-night traffic in our restaurants has dropped off about 50% because we no longer feel safe opening after 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. So a restaurant that used to be open until 1 a.m. now closes at 10. Our customers are choosing suburban dining over fears of violence in our city. We are now looking at locations outside of the Twin Cities. Minneapolis has become a ghost town. I was recently offered a restaurant in Minneapolis for 1 penny, and I said no to it. The violence in our city, we've paid for funerals for young kids that have been struck by gun violence 7 times last year. I'm heartbroken by the mass shootings and unrelenting violence going on around our country. I'm even more heartbroken about things like fentanyl that are happening in our city. I lost my kitchen manager a month ago to an accidental fentanyl overdose. We had his drug dealer's name, his phone number. He texted him and said, "Something's wrong with my drugs." He said, "You'll be fine." He died that night. 40,000 people have died from fentanyl in the last year and a half. That's 109 people a day. That is a mass murder. I'm asking you to address the real problems. Criminals feel nothing in our cities. They know responses will be slow. They know that if they're caught, they will be back out on the street typically within 24 hours. Our hope is that all of you will come together and figure out how we stop crime in our cities before our cities are gone. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Ingram. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Green. As I listen to these witnesses, it is so painful to see and understand the gun violence, not only the responsibility of those with guns to not allow them to be used by children, to put them in safe places, to not own guns necessarily. As a matter of fact, I am a person that does not believe that the Second Amendment guarantees you the right to have a gun. And I think that the Congress of the United States is divided on the gun issue. There's so many different ways that we have tried to deal with the issue of gun violence, and we don't have the votes to get rid of automatic weapons. We don't have the vote to get rid of weapons that have been used in war, that have found their ways into police stations. We don't have the votes, basically, to make this country safe. And so these mass killings are absolutely painful. To see children and individuals shot down and killed for no reason other than someone does not like the color of their skin, or someone is mentally ill, or someone wants to rob someone. All of those reasons are totally unacceptable. Mr. Green, you're taking a look at another aspect of this violence, dealing with what it does to the community, what it does to businesses, and how those people who work so very hard to strengthen our communities are basically undermined when these mass shootings take place. People move. Businesses close down. People are afraid. And so I, took one issue that I wanted to deal with today, and it is to talk about how some of these guns are purchased. The gun that was used in Uvalde, Texas, school shooting, was sold by a firearms manufacturer that offers loan installment payment plans to purchase their products under the consumer finance company Credova. These buy now, pay later financing programs make guns more accessible to purchase, only requiring a simple credit check with interest-free loans paid back in 3 to 4 monthly installments. Fintech loan providers like Credova are not involved with, nor do they have insight into the background checks conducted by retailers who sell guns. Credova itself claims on its website that approval takes seconds for most customers. As I've said, this is only one small aspect of this issue. But of course, I think the easier guns are to obtain, the way to get them cheaply, the way for young people to go on the internet and find ways to purchase and pay later, are issues that we're going to have to deal with. I wish that you coming here today could leave saying, I was at the Congress of the United States and I heard that they really are going to take some serious steps and they're going to deal with gun violence. But you're not going to leave with that message today. The message that you're going to leave with is they talked a lot about how they are absolutely devastated with the killings that take place. As Mr. Green said, prayers are not enough. And you're going to leave saying, I know that many of them pray, but Mr. Green is right, prayers are not enough. And so we all have a role in trying to deal with this violence. The United States Congress must step up to the plate, must be committed to the idea that we could stop this violence and we could take guns off the street. It's not happened yet. And so, for those of you in communities, if they're gun manufacturers, if they're gun stores, I think it makes good sense for the community to get organized and tell them that they do not wish to have them in the community. I think it makes good sense to tell parents, if you watch your child acting very strangely over a period of time, if you know they have some issues, if you know that you've been ignoring the fact that they love guns and they spend hours on television watching violence, etc. Parents, relatives, everybody's got to step up to the plate and say, this child needs some help. There's something wrong here, and stop ignoring it. And so there's so many ways that all of us must play a part in dealing with the gun violence. Thank you for being here today. Thank Mr. Green for holding this aspect of it. But all of us should not be able to go to bed at night and rest, seeing the violence that is going on, the lives that are lost, and the businesses that are destroyed, and the neighborhoods and communities are literally torn apart because of it. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Green.
Gentlelady yields. The chair now recognizes the distinguished ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to our witnesses for appearing before this committee. Look, crime is running rampant across our country, so it's imperative that Congress focus on the serious, damaging impact that lawlessness has had on our communities. We must restore order. As we examine the impact crime has had on local economies, we are grateful to Mr. Brian Ingram for joining us today from St. Paul, Minnesota. He's the only business owner on this witness panel who has firsthand experience trying to live and trying to operate a business in a nearly lawless environment. Catastrophic crime rates are not unique to the Twin Cities in Minnesota. It's plaguing communities across the United States, from New York to San Francisco and cities in between. Americans in urban areas face increases in carjackings, theft, burglaries, vandalism, and assault. This has led to a divestment in local economies because safety trumps all other priorities, and many people cannot safely run a business in such dangerous conditions. That divestment hits low-income communities the hardest. So, how did we get here, and why is crime running rampant across the United States? We locked down our citizens for a year, stripped them of in-person activities that help keep people out of a life of crime, school, extracurriculars, community engagement, and mental health resources. Then Democrats championed a nationwide campaign against law enforcement, which has made the police force so politically unpopular that many communities like St. Paul, Minnesota, where Mr. Ingram lives and runs his businesses, don't have enough sworn-in law enforcement officers to protect the community. As we heard from Mr. Ingram, when residents call 911, it's not uncommon to be told no one can help them. Mr. Ingram, can you please share with the committee what changes you've had to make to your business to protect your employees and customers from crime?
Yeah, one of the things we've had to do, of course, is shortening our hours, even bringing in our staff a little later. We have a breakfast restaurant that used to open at 6 a.m., and now we pushed that back to 7 a.m. Just because we wanted to be light out before our staff would come in. Our restaurant's closing at 10 o'clock. We have a pub that would primarily do business late night. That's now closed. Security cameras, alarm systems. We've spent so much on those types of things it doesn't deter anybody. The safety stuff we've done is no deterrence.
Do you have a number that you have spent? How much of these additional measures have cost you?
Hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know that I can even put a number on the sales. We have 2 new restaurants. We're reinvesting. Those restaurants we're planning on not keeping open. That's going to lead into the millions of dollars until something changes in our city.
Lastly, how have other businesses in your community reacted to the violence?
So many of them are gone. And what you're seeing so much is in minority parts of the city, restaurants are closing at a rapid pace. I believe it's 1 in 3 now that are closing down. And typically, those are in areas that are underserved. We're seeing restaurants, we're seeing businesses close day in and day out, and it continues to grow. Right now in Minneapolis, it's a ghost town when you drive through Minneapolis.
And you talk to many of these restaurateurs like yourself, and are they experiencing similar issues?
Yeah, I believe all of us. And I mean, you could own a yarn store across the street from us. We've seen it. They've been robbed. Little mailbox, et cetera. It's across the board, and there's no business. We thought we were being targeted. We had 7 robberies within a year and thought we were being targeted, and we went out to our neighborhoods. Nope, I got robbed yesterday. No, I got robbed the day before. And nobody seems to want to share that message and talk about it.
Well, Thank you for doing it. These catastrophic levels of crime across this country have made people afraid to go to work, to eat out with their families, to park their cars in the street, and simply to just be outside when it's dark. This is no way to live. But let's be very clear. Democrats have normalized this lawlessness and demonized law enforcement. As a result, law enforcement in many of these urban areas like the Twin Cities do not have the resources they need to keep people and their businesses and properties safe. When residents call 911 for help, they are often told no one can come out. Mr. Ingram, thank you for your time today. As Democrats have politicized safety and championed the destructive defund the police movement, your perspective is invaluable as a business owner doing your best to support your community. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the title for this committee hearing, or at least the subtitle, Thoughts and Prayers Are Not Enough, which I agree with politically and theologically. You know, Moses had guided the children of Israel, Hebrews, today's Jewish people, to the banks of the Red Sea. And he stood there praying, 14:15 of Exodus, praying. And God says to Moses, shut up, stop praying, and start moving. And I did something last week that I don't feel good about, but I just couldn't do it anymore. When we were asked to stand for thoughts and prayers in the chamber after another killing, I went outside and I did my own prayers as I do every evening at my apartment. I think it's important for everybody to understand that I don't know how this explosion of people trying to defund the police has become, so much of a position that I'm not sure is healthy. I've not said it. I don't think anybody here has ever said it. I've heard it from 3 or 4 people. It doesn't make sense, so I don't embrace it. Mr. Ingram, thank you so much. I saw the news report on your work, and thank you very much for what you're doing in your community. Mayor Brown, thank you for being here. I'm a former mayor. You're on center stage of the American drama as a mayor. I grew up in public housing, and I got into it with somebody. We were fighting. So he picked up a brick and threw it and hit me. If you were up close, you could see I grew a mustache to hide the stitches. I had 15. And I've said this to my own children, that if that had happened today, Will wouldn't have hit me with a brick. He would have shot me. And instead of me, going to the hospital and coming back and becoming friends, we weren't in it. I didn't shoot him or anything else. I don't even think I had ever seen a gun, a real live gun, when this happened to me at 14 and 15. Do you think, Mayor, that Buffalo would be in a better position if your police department didn't have to deal with the fact that just about everybody they stop is armed, and everybody they go to deal with that are messing up the businesses, they're armed?
Congressman Cleaver, there are too many guns on the streets of communities all across the country. In Buffalo, our police have had to deal with too many illegal weapons on the streets. And responding to Ranking Member Emmer, We did not defund police in the city of Buffalo. In fact, I have increased the budget for the police department. With the mass shooting in Buffalo at the Tops supermarket, our police responded within 1 minute of the 911 call going out. And if not for the quick response of police and fire, many more lives would have been lost in our community. Police were able to convince the shooter in Buffalo to turn himself in and not go back into the store, not go down the street. And they were outgunned by this individual who had an assault rifle. The individual was wearing military-grade body armor. He was encountered in the store by a security guard who was a retired 30-year police officer of the Buffalo Police Department who got off 11 shots. But because of the military-grade body armor, they had no effect on this individual, and he was able to kill the security guard in the store. But if that security officer had not engaged this white supremacist shooter, his stated intent in a manifesto that he left would have been to kill many more people in the community. So yes, our police are engaged.
Has expired. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ingram, first off, I want to commend you for the phenomenal way you have served your community through some really difficult times the last few years. It's truly inspiring, and I want to thank my friend, Ranking Member Emmer, for inviting you to testify before this subcommittee today. 2020 was very challenging. I mean, it was just one of the most challenging years we faced, and there's no reason to sugarcoat it. The pandemic and the resulting economic downturn paired with the social unrest happening all at the same time was rough on all of us, but especially for the Twin Cities. I want to pick up where Mr. Emmer left off. You talked about how your business has had to reinventing the role of the prosecutor from a government official who supports and enforces the rule of law to an official that gets to cherry pick which laws are worth enforcing.
Prosecutors and said, how do you let the person that robbed me and has a track record, I believe he had 50 priors, and he's out within 24 hours? You don't even give me a heads up. I've posted on social media his pictures of him breaking into my restaurants. Maybe he's now coming for me or my family because he's angry with us. We're petrified, I believe, within the Twin Cities that these criminals are being released. Yeah, and now maybe we're the victim another time. For sure, they come back to our business and rob us again.
So in that instance, I mean, best practice across the country, victim advocates reach released. Did that occur?
It did not occur. It occurred, I believe I got notified about forcing the rule of law. Right now, we're not going to have a city to return to. So yes, we could leave. We've thought about it. But what does that do to our community? And what does it do to the people that we love and we want to serve?
Sure, thank you. I appreciate you being here, and I think the pendulum swings back often, and we need to enforce the rule of law. We need to keep people safe. That's just very basic to the form of the rule of law in government. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Garcia, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Garcia, if you can hear me, would you wave? Okay, we understand that you may be having some technical difficulties. With this understanding, Mr. Garcia, we will work with you to eliminate those difficulties. And in the interim, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, who is also the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for bringing this very, very critical hearing forward today. I think it's, as the chairwoman said, nothing could be more important these days than trying to go beyond the prayers and thoughts into real action. And I would hope that this hearing will result in some proposals that we can put forward before the Congress. Because here we are once again to discuss gun violence, an issue that has devastated our community and our nation, our families, too frequently for just far too long. And as we have covered here today, it is important that we consider long-term impacts of mass shootings as the initial shock and outrage fades from the public domain. My home state of Texas is tragically no stranger to such despicable acts of violence as we most recently saw in Uvalde. The tragedy in Uvalde is an unthinkable one, but we may not let it fade to an unspeakable one. We will continue to fight for justice and for the entire community impacted, and I'm glad that today we can take time to consider the long-term impacts to the surrounding area. In Texas alone, Mr. Chairman, and it's your home state as well as mine, the annual cost of widespread gun violence, both for the safety of our constituents and for their economic success. I know the chairwoman mentioned the shooter in Uvalde, and Mr. Chairman, I've read the Texas House Committee report over the weekend, and it found that there was no legal impediment to the attacker buying 2 AR-15 style rifles, 60 magazines, and over 2,000 rounds of ammunition when he turned 18, most of which he did online in preparation when he was still 17, online. And as she said, some of these platforms are allowing installment sales. And the real question that I have on my mind is, where did he get all that money? Because I totaled up what he bought, and it was something around $5,000. So, Mr. Byrd, no, it's is it Brodeur? Can you shed some light on how financial technology companies could actually assist, or what we could do to help us assist us in preventing illegal firearm activity? Oh, that's why we have you as an expert.
Yeah.
And the rest of the panel, if anybody wants to help.
Yes. It's not an easy question. I mean, if you look at the characteristics of perpetrators of mass shootings, many of them are in poverty, unemployed. Some that are really surprised to hear about the characteristics, socioeconomic characteristics of this specific shooter. If we're trying to use technology to try to make it harder to buy guns, or I'm not entirely sure it's going to be feasible, or that there is easy ways to make it harder to buy guns without legislation, to be honest.
Well, should it be so easy to just go online? I mean, he was 17 years old, and the AR-15 rifle and some of the bullets and things, one was $2,054. Another purchase that he made was $1,081.42. I mean, why is it so easy to just go online?
Well, all the information about previous shootings are online. Strategies used in previous shootings are online. It's quite easy to get a credit card in this country, much easier than other countries, to be honest. Someone can get credit easily and buy things online. It's unclear whether parents really look at what is bought by teenagers, adolescents. We're talking about usually perpetrators are very young, maybe 21 years old on average, depending on how we define a mass shooting. These people are looking mostly for attention. They're on different networks. For instance, in my research, I look at networks of neo-Nazis and how they join different networks online, how the information is shared. It's so easy to get that information. I mean, what you can try to do is try to limit these networks, limit how people access information online, but in terms of limiting what can be bought online without limiting credit or how easy it is to take your parents' credit card, I just don't see it, to be honest.
All right,
I don't
thank
see
you.
it easily.
Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time, but I do have some questions if there is a second round.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for the glitch I had, but I want to thank you for holding this hearing and, of course, discussing this critical topic, and that is mass shootings in America. There have been over 340 mass shootings in 2022, and that number continues to climb. In the last 2 months, again, we've had 3 especially deadly mass shootings at a grocery store, at a school, and most recently at the 4th of July parade in my home state. We often see the devastating impacts of gun violence as it occurs on the news, but once the coverage dies down, communities are left to pick up the pieces and face the long-term outcomes. And as we address the horrifying consequences of mass shootings, we must also confront the challenges of other forms of gun violence that don't make the news. For decades, working class and minority neighborhoods have been subject to targeted economic discrimination, including redlining, predatory lending practices. Many shootings take place in these same systemically disadvantaged areas like the South and the West Sides of Chicago, where there's been a lack of jobs and investment. So a question to our panelist, Mr. Broder, while limiting gun access, especially across access to weapons of war, is a vital and necessary and life-saving first step, we must also consider other factors that contribute to mass shootings and gun violence, like disinvestment from communities and access to mental health services. My question is, can you talk about the cycles of disinvestment and gun violence and how it keeps communities at risk?
Sure, thank you for the question. As I said, well, the first thing that should be noted is if we're talking about violence in general, it's one thing. We're talking about mass shooting, these are really random. It's incredibly hard to predict where it's going to be the next mass shooting. I've tried, the FBI has tried, so many people have tried. It's incredibly hard to predict where it's going to happen. It can happen mostly in urban areas, but other than that, it's going to be incredibly hard to figure out where it's going to happen. In terms of business cycles, in terms of, in general, the economy, could this lead to potentially more mass shooting if there's a recession? It could, but it's going to be very hard to try to prevent it because we don't know where it's going to happen. In terms of these perpetrators needing mental health support, 100%. The vast majority of them have a history of mental health illness that is documented. So it's not something that we learn exposed, but we learn that we knew, a doctor knew, the kid or the children or the adolescent, young adult actually was seeing a psychiatrist, for instance. This happens quite a lot. So this is one of the predictor, for sure, providing more healthcare to help, on average, the average young Americans who suffer with schizophrenia or mental health disease would be amazing, just for the sake of their mental health, but also potentially preventing mass shooting. When we think about what can we do to help financially communities that are struggling with crime, you know, if I think about Buffalo and Mayor Brown, this community just suffered a lot, and they're going to need financial support. And the thing that I find extremely frustrating is if you look at mass shootings, which are random and just happen somewhere, the consequences are permanent. And I like to think horizontally when I think about a problem, and the first thing that comes in mind is natural disasters. Natural disasters just occur once. It's random. It's going to hit somewhere. Think of like a hurricane. And when we look at the economic consequences of these disasters, usually they're not permanent. They're short run. And one of the big difference between natural disaster and mass shooting is when there's a mass shooting, there's no support for these communities. Financial support. They need financial support after a mass shooting. This is obvious. And this might help to alleviate some of the economic consequences. Of course, some of these communities need help even before mass shooting. But I'm not gonna lie, there's no way you can predict where it's gonna be the next mass shooting. We just don't know. And there's tons of communities that need help, those that suffer most from violent crime. I would target these communities if we would have the funding, but in general, there's no way you can predict where it's going to happen next, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. It looks like my time has expired, so I yield back to the chair.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciated us holding this hearing. And one of the things that, it's so hard for me, even the title of looking at the economic cost of gun violence, but I understand that we need to pay attention who is profiting off of this pain and this trauma that is really jeopardizing so many lives across our country and really just hurting so many families. These costs, as we all know, have been felt particularly among our children, specifically those that are our school age children. We all know that education is by far the largest category of municipal bond issuance in our country as well. As mass shootings have increased, our education dollars have been increasingly funneled towards school security rather than investing in our teachers or our students. And in 2021, Mr. Chair, the so-called school security industry made $3.1 billion. As the American Prospect has written, the financial services industry makes money lending to school districts to install security upgrades, and those upgrades manifestly do little or nothing to prevent mass shootings, as we continue to see. And they make more money lending to companies that make AR-15s, the weapon of choice for mass murders of children, the same companies. Some banks like Citibank have previously refused to finance the gun industry, and I applaud them for this. However, in 2021, Texas enacted a law that blocks banks from doing business with state and local governments that discriminate against the gun industry. Texas has the largest municipal bond market in the country. And in response, Citi stated in 2021 that it did not have a practice, policy, guidance, or directive that discriminates against firearm entity or firearm trade associations. So, Ms. Bird-Sharps, do you think that laws like the one enacted in Texas are intended to have, a negative effect, particularly in the municipal bond market? And what message is the Texas law sending to banks like Citibank that have taken steps to limit their exposure to gun industry?
Thank you for your question. I would say that in the work that we've been doing, the message that is sending is that businesses can't take a position in terms of contributing to reducing these costs that I just spoke to today, and it's critical that institutions, that all of us, not facilitate high-risk transactions, including, for instance, sales of assault weapons and weapons of war to young people, et cetera. And I think I was going to say that working on gun violence prevention is a hard topic, but I think the hopeful news for me is that we do know research is increasingly pointing us in the direction of policies that do make a difference, and of practices. And of the business community as well as of local people that can reduce the kind of injuries that are so costly to our society.
Yeah, no, I think the responsibility that we're talking about in this committee on the financial service industry, they do have a role here. And, according to every town, the cost of gun violence nationally is $280 billion. When first responders, law enforcement, and criminal justice services respond to mass shootings, this results in enormous cost on taxpayers. The research estimates that Las Vegas, Nevada, where mass shooting in 2017 resulted in $600 million in taxpayer dollars. Mayor Brown, do you think it's fair that your community and your neighbors pay such a steep price while the gun companies profit from mass shootings? Do the gun companies have a role to play in making victims and survivors in communities like yours whole after mass shootings?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. I don't think that it's fair that communities like my community of Buffalo and other communities across the country that have suffered these mass shootings have to bear the financial burden of those shootings. I think the gun companies, the gun manufacturers do have a role to play, and I think it's important for there to be liability on the part of gun manufacturers for these terrible crimes that continue to play themselves out across the country. As members of Congress have stated today, over 340 mass shootings in this country this year alone. The financial consequences are devastating to communities, and I believe that gun manufacturers do have a role to play. They should suffer liability for these crimes that are being committed in our communities.
Thank you, and I yield.
The gentlelady yields. The gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axney, is now recognized. She is also the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community, and Development and Insurance. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. And Mayor Brown, sincere thank you to you and my condolences to those in your communities who have suffered so greatly. Thank you for being here with us. Of course, I want to start by saying that mass shootings and gun violence have a lot more direct impacts and much more tragic than what the economic impacts are, and those will always be more important. But of course, we are on Financial Services Committee, and we need to look at whatever impact these shootings are having on our communities, because it's important to stop them, which is why I have said for years on end, we need an assault weapons ban back in place. Just this year, Iowans have seen 3 people die outside a church in Ames very recently, 12 people shot in April in Cedar Rapids, and a 15-year-old killed and 2 others shot outside a high school in Des Moines, right in my district. That was just a few blocks from our state capitol. And unfortunately, I had a teletown hall a couple weeks ago where one of those students at East High School called asking what Congress had done and what Congress could do more so that we could fix this situation. And although I'm quite impressed that a 15-year-old is paying attention to politics and getting involved at such a young age, I almost started tearing up because it broke my heart that a 15-year-old had to call their congresswoman and say, what else can you do so I can feel safe and my family and my kids that I go to school with can feel safe? This is a tragedy of where we're at. So I'm thinking about these kids, and Dr. Singh, I want to ask you, you've studied the long-term economic impacts of school shootings on the students at these schools. I know this isn't going to be good news for us to hear, but what can you tell me about what you found?
So looking specifically at the long-term economic outcomes, I'll focus on some of my research along with some of the other academic papers on this issue. What these papers show that after shootings, and this could be shootings where there are no fatalities, there's increased absenteeism. The students who are exposed are more likely to repeat a grade. When we look at the medium-term educational effects of these shootings, these students are less likely to go to college, are less likely to complete college. And of course, this would have longer-term impacts. And this paper finds longer-term impacts on earnings and the likelihood of being employed. So there's exposed students are less likely to be employed, and their earnings are also lower at the ages of 24 to 26 years. So there are long-term economic effects for these students who are exposed to gun violence in schools. Thank you.
And are there steps that we can take to help there?
So in one of my studies, we analyzed the effect of Safe Passage program in Chicago. And the reason we were studying Chicago is, as most of us in this room know, the crime around schools is really high. So what the city of Chicago did was they placed guards around schools. And these guards are civilians. They are not police officers. And they are placed for like 2 to 3 hours in the morning and 2 to 3 hours in the afternoon. So basically during the arrival and dismissal times. And that helps reduce violent crime. And the program was effective. The effects persisted for even 3 years after the program was implemented. It was cost effective to do it because these are basically parents and adults from the community who are doing this community monitoring. And the idea was having these more eyes on the street might help reduce crime, basically deter students from loitering around. They go to school more, and it also helped improve attendance. So we not only see improvement in violent crime, but also that these students start going to school more often. So the obvious question is, what really is going on here, and why is this program effective? One of the conjectures that we come up with is because these are people from the community, they really know the students, and we find higher effects for the high school students. So they go to school, and instead of committing a crime or getting involved in criminal activities, they're attending the classes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And we just have a bit of time here, but the impact of school shootings on property values absolutely has an impact. And Mr. Brother, I'm wondering if you can tell me, can you share what you found there? What is that impact on housing prices in areas where school shootings have happened?
Housing prices decreased by about 2.5%, usually on average. Again, the effect is pretty much permanent. The effect seems to be larger in the streets or localities close to the shooting, but the effect is also present for the rest of the county. Thank you.
Thank you.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Ingram, you referenced George Floyd. What that officer did to George Floyd was unconscionable. But you wouldn't paint all peace officers with the same brush, would you?
Thank you for that question. Absolutely not.
A simple yes or no would suffice for now, would you?
No.
Do you think that when one peace officer commits an egregious offense, that all officers ought to be said to be bad officers?
No.
How do you feel when you hear people doing that? Just claiming that all officers are bad because one officer does something, or maybe multiple officers. There have been many egregious circumstances, but how do you feel when people do that?
It's heartbreaking.
All right. Do you think that because one prosecutor releases someone or doesn't prosecute a case properly, that you should paint all prosecutors with the same brush?
No.
One judge makes a mistake or lets someone out, and that person commits an offense, you think you should paint all judges with the same brush, Mr. Ingram?
No.
How do you feel when you hear people painting all judges with the same brush, all prosecutors with the same brush? The prosecutors are doing it. The liberal prosecutors are doing it. How do you feel when you hear that, Mr. Ingram?
I can only speak to what's happening.
I'm not asking you about what's happening. You don't think that all police officers ought to be abused verbally, but you don't, and I would assume that as the good-natured person you are, you would not want to see all judges painted with the same brush, would you?
Correct.
Thank you. I appreciate you helping me to help my colleagues better understand that they shouldn't do that. Now, Mayor, I thank you for being here again. The business community. The business community has a role to play in this as well. What do you see as the role of the business community?
The business community should invest equitably throughout the community. They should not exclude customers in certain parts of the community because that creates, that exacerbates poverty. It contributes to crime. It devalues certain areas of the community. In Buffalo, in the mass shooting that we experienced, the top supermarket company was the first company almost 20 years ago, supermarket chain, that made a commitment to invest in an urban area of the city of Buffalo, in East Buffalo, that previously had been a food desert. And the investment in that store that I and others fought and negotiated to bring to that community became a center of community. People came there not only to shop, but to meet and spend time with friends. And so the crime that was committed there was a heinous act of racist violence.
Mayor, let me intercede for just a moment. I only have 49 seconds thereabout. Do you think that the business community should take a public position as it relates to this violence, these mass shootings?
Yes, I do.
And Mayor, you have a Buffalo-Niagara partnership similar to a Chamber of Commerce. And I have a letter from them. They indicate earlier this year, the BNP stepped out of the confines of our traditional advocacy priorities and brought together a coalition of several regional chambers of commerce across New York State to call on Congress to pass assault weapons ban. This action followed the racist mass shooting at a Tops supermarket in Buffalo on May 14, 2022. I'm proud of what you have been able to accomplish with your Chamber of Commerce. Do you think that chambers of commerce across the country should take similar positions?
I absolutely do.
And I'm concerned about the National Chamber of Commerce. It seems to me that they ought to take a position as well.
I agree with that.
Now, in closing, let me just share this quickly. In Texas, at Robb Elementary, hundreds of peace officers were there, and we know what happened. The video speaks for itself. I don't condemn all police officers, but I do condemn those that did not move in to save lives. My uncle was a deputy sheriff. I'm where I am today because of a deputy sheriff. I don't condemn all peace officers, but those that are wrong, I do. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. And I want to say that Ms. Garcia is going to be recognized, but if hundreds of peace officers didn't take out that gunman, I don't think we should expect a teacher with a pistol to take out a gunman. Teachers ought to be allowed to teach, and we ought to have safety officers who do their jobs. With that, Ms. Garcia, you are now recognized for your introduction without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to enter for the record the report that I referenced, the investigative committee on the Robb Elementary School shooting made by the Texas House of Representatives for the record.
Without objection is done, and I will be introducing the letter from the Buffalo-Niagara Partnership without objection. Also, I introduce without objection the economic cost of gun violence. And the chair would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able to. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to email address provided to your offices. This hearing is now adjourned.